Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little, and today I am bringing you a new class where I'm going to discuss combating limpers. And the reason I decided to make this class is because I have never really done much material on combating limpers, primarily because in the games that I typically play, the highest buy-in tournaments and high buy-in cash games, there are no limpers. People do not limp. That's just not a play that people make, because it's a bad play for the most part. There are very few spots where you should be open limping. However, in the small stakes games, there are a ton of limpers. And I realized this whenever I played $1, $2 no limit in preparation for my book, Strategies for Beating Small Stakes Poker Cash Games. I played a pretty good amount at $1, $2 no limit, and I watched players open limp horribly and also play horribly against the limpers. And in this class, I'm going to be going through a ton of information explaining how I play against various limpers, and I'm also going to bring you many hand examples that show how I approach various scenarios. So when do people usually limp? You're going to find that they typically limp in small stakes cash games, usually 2-5 and below. Also from early position in middle and high stakes cash games. I actually don't think it's that bad to open limp from early position, but I tend to not do it personally. You're going to find that whenever you open limp, it by nature takes out some hands from your raising range. And if your limping range is weak and your raising range is strong, that's not really where you want to be. You don't want to let your opponents know they can cut out a large portion of your limping range whenever you limp. And also you want to play big pots with your big hands. So limping does not make a whole lot of sense to me. Also in small stakes tournaments, you'll see players limping, especially in the early levels. And sometimes in the higher levels, higher buy-in tournaments, you'll see them limping in the early levels as well. The first thing you have to recognize is that all limpers are not limping the same range. I typically noticed in the $1, $2 games that most people thought that all the limpers were just weak, or that they always had good hands and just were not folding. And I think that if you try to put every limper into that same box, as in, this guy limps, so he must be weak, you're going to make huge errors. So there are a few metrics that you can use to classify the limpers. So the first thing you need to look at is where are they limping from? Second thing you need to look at is what is their likely limping range? And the third thing you need to look at is how will they respond to aggression? So first, where are they limping from? This is the easiest one to take a look at. If they're in early position, it means that they have to worry about everyone else at the table, and also you have to worry about everyone else at the table waking up with a strong hand. So for that reason, you're going to find that you usually want to not mess around with early position limpers too often, especially when you are also in early position. And when your opponents limp in middle or late position, that's usually the sign of someone who's just limping with a wide range of hands that are not good enough to raise, in their opinion. Because if they had a good hand, they typically would raise and want to either steal the pot, get money in the pot, protect their hand, etc., etc., etc. So that's the first thing you have to be aware of. And this is the easiest thing to figure out because you can just look where the player is limping from. Next thing you need to look at is what is their limping range? Is it a wide range or is it a tight range? And then once you look at that range, you have to ask yourself, do they raise with their strong hands and limp everything else, or do they limp with everything? So you need to ask yourself about that. Once you figure out if this guy's limping a wide range or a tight range, are there hands he is raising with in his range? So what I mean by this, if you take a look at a standard tight limping range, so this is a matrix of all the hands that you could possibly have. A lot of tight players will play a range roughly like this. The yellow hands are the hands they raise. Pocket nines are better. Ace queen are better. And then they limp everything else that is in the blue. And then they're not playing all the other hands. So they're limping ace-8 suited, 8-7 suited, pocket twos, pocket sevens, pocket eights, etc. And I think this is fairly standard for what most tight players are limping. But clearly you can't just put everyone on this range when they limp because everyone is not tight. This is a relatively loose limping range where they're raising their best hands, the same, this is pocket tens are better, and then ace queen are better. Maybe they raise ace jack, maybe they raise ace 10, maybe they raise ace 9, who knows? That's up for you to pay attention and figure out. And they're limping a bunch of other junk. You'll see some players who have overly loose limping range, where they are raising a much wider range of hands. You can see maybe middle pairs and better, a lot of suited Broadway hands, a lot of aces. And then they're limping everything else. And I'm not going to go through how to play against each specific range like this, because quite often you'll see someone who has a raising range of this, the yellow hands here, combined with the entire limping range of this guy over here. Or, you can see these things mixed up. Also, you'll see some people have a limp re-raising range combined with a raising range. So take a look at this. Some people will limp with their small pairs, their suited connectors, suited Broadway hands, and aces, kings, and ace king, looking to limp re-raise with aces, kings, and ace king, and limp call with all of these other hands in blue, while at the same time raising with the hands in yellow. So this is a relatively interesting range, and this is actually a pretty tough range to play against. And if you are going to have a limping range from early position, as I said that some high-stakes cash game players do, it's going to look roughly like this. This is a hard range to defend against because the raising range still has strong hands, right? Ace-queen suited is pretty strong. Pocket queens is pretty strong. And the limping range is also somewhat protected because it does have ace-king, aces, kings, king-queen, and then some suited connected hands and pairs. So this is a pretty good limping range to have if you are going to develop a limping range from early position. But again, I do not think you want to be limping from early position. There are also players who have a loose limp re-raising range where they are limping with aces, kings, ace, king. Although, of course, some people only limp re-raise with the aces exactly. Some people limp re-raise with aces and kings and queens and jacks. So what this is trying to show you is that you have to figure out the range of hands your opponent is limping with the intention of calling your raise, limping with the intention of folding to your raise, and limping with the intention of limp re-raising. In general, I think most people are limping with a weak-ish range, perhaps something like this. I think this is the typical range of most loose, splashy players who want to see the flop. They know they need to see the flop with a lot of hands, but they only raise with their absolute best hands. And this is the standard player in small stakes cash games. And of course, maybe he's limp re-raising exactly aces or something like that too. So be aware of that and recognize that the possibilities are almost limitless. You need to figure out what your opponents are doing and then adjust to take advantage of them. Also, some people have a limp folding range. I did not encounter that very much in the small stakes cash games. Like they'd be limp calling with 9-5 suited and whatnot. Whereas in tournaments, people would limp stuff like 9-5 suited and then just fold to a raise. So be aware that some people do have a somewhat wide limp folding range. So the next thing you need to figure out is how do they respond to aggression? Will they play straightforwardly? Will they fight back aggressively? Are they calling stations? And do they limp re-raise their best hand? So do they play straightforwardly or fight back aggressively? What this means is, can you count on your opponent to limp in with a bunch of trash, call your raise, and then check fold every time he misses? If you're against someone like that, you are in a very good game because you are not going to have to face many difficult decisions. So say someone limps, who you know has a loose, splashy range, you can raise with all sorts of stuff. They're going to call, and then they're going to check fold on the flop something like 60% of the time. And if you can give yourself a little bit of pre-flop fold equity, plus a lot of flop fold equity, meaning they're going to fold a lot to your pre-flop raise or to your turn or to your flop bet, you're just going to scoop up a lot of dead money. If they'll fight back aggressively, you have a much tougher scenario because now you have to expect to get bluffed sometimes. And if you're going to be getting bluffed sometimes, then that changes things up. If they're calling stations, that changes the range you need to be attacking your opponents with significantly because perhaps hands like ace-9 are normally kind of marginal against a tighter limper. But if your opponent's just a loose calling station, ace-9 becomes pretty great because he's going to be limping with a bunch of ace-x and even 9x hands, like 9-6. He's just going to try to see a flop with 9-6. So definitely be aware of if your opponent is a calling station or not. And also always be aware if your opponent is limp re-raising their best hands because that will change things up a little bit for you. And we're going to be discussing that as we get deep into this class. It's also important to realize that your hand values are very relative. Sometimes ace-jack offsuit is a premium hand, and other times it's marginal. And as an example of that, suppose a very tight player limps from early position. You should almost never raise with ace-jack if you think your opponent's limping range is something like pocket tens or better and then ace-queen or better, because your opponent's entire limping range has your ace-jack crushed. So in that spot, ace-jack could even be just a fold. Well, it probably should be a fold given you lose to all those hands. However, if a very loose, splashy player limps from the cutoff and you're on the button with ace-jack is an incredibly easy raise because your opponent's limping all sorts of trash that you demolish. So you have to be aware that hand values are not strictly, this hand is premium, this hand is marginal, this hand is trash, and so forth. So for example, premium hands, well, whenever we're talking about what to do in our scenario, I generally want to be speaking about how to play each bunch of hands. And so I've broken them down into 5 categories. We have premium hands, which are the hands you typically think of as being very strong. But like I said, sometimes ace-jack is marginal, sometimes ace-queen is marginal. Marginal meaning, I guess, decent, given I wrote there, decent right here. Decent hands are usually going to be your middle pairs, your big aces, besides your premium aces, and then your Broadway hands. These are hands that are usually pretty good. You're usually pretty happy to see them, but at the same time, it's not like you're trying to get your whole stack in. Then you have drawing hands. This is going to be primarily suited connectors, suited aces, and small pairs. It's worth mentioning suited aces. Like I just said, if you're against a very tight player who has a very strong range when he limps, hands like ace-jack suited and king-queen suited are normally just strong hands. They're normally in the premium hand range or the decent, very, very good decent hand range. But against a tight player, these hands become fairly exclusively drawing hands. So they revert from being premium hands / decent hands to drawing hands because you're not trying to make one pair of them at that point. You're trying to make a straight or flush. So realize that hands don't go from just premium, decent, junky to trash. They can also go from decent to drawing, assuming you're in the right scenario. Then you have your junky hands. These are hands that they don't really have much drawing potential. They also don't have much top pair, top kicker potential. So this is going to be primarily ace-x, king-x, and offsuited connectors and gappers, like 10-9, 10-8, 8-7, etc. These are hands that are not particularly great, and you definitely do not want to be playing them on a regular basis. But sometimes there are situations that arise where you can play these hands. And then you can have total trash. And if you have studied much of my poker material, you should know that I am not a big fan of playing absolute trash. I do not think it is necessary. I do not think it's mandatory, especially in small stakes games where you are playing against players who do not like to fold, stuff like middle pair. Total trash has no real purpose of being played. You're not trying to create an image. You're not trying to make your opponents think you're crazy or anything like that because they do not care. They're just playing their cards. And if you constantly spew off a few big blinds here and there with a marginal made hand, you're going to have a tough time ever getting a hold of a lot of money. Especially against calling station-y opponents, playing a tight, aggressive game, and when I say tight, I don't mean super knit, but kind of tight, aggressive game is usually going to be the best way to go about it. But we are going to discuss some spots for bluffing, so don't think you can just sit here and only play good cards and win the maximum. I definitely think you can sit here and play just reasonably good cards and do well enough, but I always strive to teach my students how to win a large amount. I'm not trying to teach you to sit and play $1, $2 and win $3 per hour. I'm trying to teach you to win $20 per hour or $30 per hour. And you do that by getting out of line and taking advantage of your opponent's mistakes. And a lot of people do not realize that quite often the best way to take advantage of your opponent's mistakes, especially if they only apply a lot of pressure with their good hands, is just to fold. So, first thing we're going to do is we are going to discuss how to play against early position limpers. Again, we have to categorize our opponents, and this is the easiest way to start breaking our opponents down. From early position, some players limp all of their playable hands, which is going to be everything they plan on playing, which could be a very tight range or a very wide range. Some players raise their best hands and limp their marginal hands. This is going to be the type of guy who raises maybe pocket jacks or better, ace, king, ace, queen, and then limps everything else they plan on playing. And then some people limp their very best and their very worst hands. These are the limp re-raisers. So figure out your opponent's specific tendencies. Some guys will have a range where they're limping everything, but that range could be only incredibly strong hands, or it could be a range of the top 70% of hands because your opponent thinks queen 7 offsuit's good enough. And you have to recognize that everyone is different. However, when facing early position raisers, I want to make this as clear as I possibly can. You do not want to get too out of line. You can get a tiny bit out of line, but you can't get too out of line because everyone yet to act will pick up a premium hand roughly 4 or 5% of the time. And if you're sitting here raising ace 9 offsuit or king 10 offsuit into 6 or 7 people yet to act, you are going to be leaving a lot of money on the table and making very big errors. So we're going to go through how to play the specific hands versus each type of limper. So there's a few things you're going to notice here. First, we're talking about the player's position, early position. Then we're going to discuss our opponent's range. I'm going to roughly break this down into a wide range and a loose range, a wide range, a tight range, and then a range of hands that is going to limp re-raise you with their best hands and limp call with their marginal hands. That's what we're going to discuss from early position. Late position, we're going to get to that later in this class, but I think most people in late position are just limping trash. So we will discuss primarily what to do when they're limping with their trashy hands. We're also going to discuss how to play each type of hand. And I'm going to be giving hand examples for specific types of hands throughout this class. I'm not going to go through with hand examples for every single one every single time. Otherwise, we'd have 100 hands. But I'm just going to briefly talk through my rough strategy for each type of hand. And I'm also going to type in here what I would be doing in general. So when you have a premium hand and a tight, or a player with a wide range limps from early position, you typically want to raise. And we're raising with these hands because we want to get value. We're not really concerned with isolating our opponent. I know that a lot of players get it in their minds that they need to protect their hand or make their opponents fold their hands that are drawing thin. But you do not want your opponents to fold. It's very, very important for you to recognize that if you make your opponents fold hands that you crush, they're folding out very little equity. This is especially the case when you have a really premium hand. So for default bet sizing, what I typically do is I raise to roughly the size of the pot. As a very quick side note, the way you figure out the size of the pot, let me make a new slide here so I can type it in. Pot size raise equals 3 times the last bet plus any additional money in the pot. So let's say there's one limper. So pot equals 3 times the last bet. There's one limper. That was the last amount of money that was put in the pot, plus any additional money. So there's $2 big blind and $1 big blind, or $1 small blind at $1, $2. Obviously, if you're playing, say, 100, 200 at a tournament, this would be 200, this would be 200, this would be 100. So how much is this? 3 times 2 is $6 plus 2, so 8 plus 1 equals 9. So a pot size raise over one limper would be $9. You're going to find that in a lot of smaller stakes games, this is not a quote-unquote big raise, but it is often big enough to make most people fold their trash, but it's at the same time let them come along with hands that you are in pretty good shape against, assuming you're raising primarily for value. The idea of raising bigger or smaller to try to get your opponents to call with a wider range or fold a wider range is something that I think is a very good thing to do in the games where your opponents are not picking up on what you're doing. And I'll be discussing that throughout this series whenever we discuss the hands. But if you think your opponents are not paying attention to what you're doing, you should generally raise a little bit smaller when you're raising primarily for value and a little bit larger whenever you're raising as a bluff. You're raising larger to try to make your opponents fold. You actually see the opposite of this happen, where a lot of players, they'll raise huge with their big hands to try to protect. So say someone limps and they have pocket aces, they'll make it $22 because they don't want to get outdrawn or something like that. And that is not a good thought process. You have to be okay with getting outdrawn. And also, you have to learn to be good enough at poker to get away from your hand when you happen to be in very bad shape. So we're only going to be dealing with limps in this series, but let's just, for practice, let's say you want to re-raise to the size of the pot after someone raises to $7 and 2 people call. So what would that be? We would do 3 times the last bet, which would be 7. Again, all these hand examples are going to be from $1, $2 in this series, so just remember we're playing 1-2 for the most part, although this certainly applies to tournaments, particularly the deeper stacked levels. So 3 times the last bet was 7, plus the dead money. So there were 2 $7 callers, plus the blinds, equals, so we have 21, 28, 35, 36 or 7, 38. So this would be a $38 raise over a raise to $7 and 2 callers. And if you can remember this formula, 3 times the last bet plus any additional money in the pot, you will never need to worry about how much you should raise to before the flop. You will now know the answer. So once you know that, you never have to second guess yourself. If you raise to roughly the size of the pot, you're usually going to be making pretty good decisions. So when you have a premium hand, just raise. That is by far the best play. What about when you have a decent hand? So a decent hand is something like ace-jack, king-queen, king-10 suited, maybe something like ace-9 suited. With these hands, you usually want to go ahead and raise as well over the wide range players from early position. With your weaker hands that are decent, like Jack-10 suited, 10-9 suited, calling is probably better, and that's usually what you want to do with your drawing hands. You have to realize that hands like Jack-10 suited and Ace-9 suited and Ace-8 suited, etc., they start to blend into the drawing hands. If you have a hand like Jack-10 offsuit, I think that hand starts to bleed into the junky hands, and usually with your junky hands, you're going to want to fold. Remember, the offsuited connectors, like 9, 8, 10, 9 I mentioned earlier, sort of fall in the junky hand category, and those are not quite good enough to play. Do not think that just because you can see a flop for $2 that you must see the flop every time for free or for cheap. I know it feels cheap, but if you bleed off 0.1 big blind on average every time you limp with trash, and you limp with trash 2 times per orbit, you're throwing away 0.2 big blinds per orbit, which will amount to something like 0.6 or 0.7 big blinds per hour. And if you are a marginal player winning something like 3 big blinds per hour, if you're throwing away 0.7 of them by limping with trash 2 or 3 times per orbit, that's going to cost you a lot in the long run. And I want to make it clear, every time you limp with a hand like Jack-10 offsuit versus an early position limper, it's not like you lose that whole amount. I'm always talking on average, right? Because poker is a game of averages. You're going to lose the $2 sometimes. You're going to win $10 sometimes. It's not like you just put it in there and you're out. So be aware of that. But at the same time, these are going to be losing plays, limping with your marginal junky hands. And that includes hands like ace-x offsuit, king-x offsuit, 9-8, 9-5 suited. All these hands should just be folded. And then with your trash, you should also just fold. There's absolutely no point in playing your junky or trash hands, especially against an early position raiser, because it's too likely that either the early position raiser has something good, or someone yet to act is going to have something good. And if you get raised, you typically need a reasonably good hand to call, especially if the raise is large. Briefly discussing implied odds. With your small pairs, you want to be getting 10-to-1 implied odds. And with your suited connectors and suited aces, you want to be getting 20-to-1 implied odds. So, for a brief experiment, let's pretend like we are playing 100 big blinds deep. So $200 at 1. 2. Let's say someone limps. Someone limps, you limp, someone raises to some amount. We're going to try to figure out if you can call and see a flop with these hands. So let's say someone raises to $9 and the initial limper calls. Can you call? The way you figure this out is we're playing $200 stacks and we have to put in $7 more. So let me get out the calculator real fast. So we have to put in 7 more to win 200 roughly. So we do 200 divided by 7 equals 28.6. This is our implied odds. We are putting in 1 unit, $7, to try to win 28 times that unit, which would be 200. Okay, so if someone raises to $9, we know we can call with all of these hands because 20 to 1 is more than or less than 28. We're getting better than 20 to 1 and we're getting better than 10 to 1. Let's say instead he raises to 14. So now we have to put in $12 more. So now we take 200 divided by 12. So notice now we're getting 16.6 to 1. So that's not quite 20 to 1. So now if we limp with something like 9-8 suited, someone yet to act raises to $14 and someone raises, and then they fold back around to us. We need to fold the suited aces because we are not going to hit the flop often enough to allow us to easily continue. And this is important. If you find yourself limping with hands like 8-9 suited or ace 7 suited, get raised big, and then it folds back around to you and you call, you are giving away money. However, we are getting good enough implied odds with the small pairs. And that's just because with small pairs, you know on the flop if you have a good hand or not. If you flop a set, that's fantastic. If you don't, you're just folding. Suited connectors are not so easy to play because you flop a draw a lot of the time, and a draw is not the nuts. It's nowhere near the nuts. You have to make the nuts from there. So make sure you are getting the right implied odds if you do limp and get raised. So to learn how I combat limpers, my complete strategy for combating limpers in this incredibly long class where I go through 20 different hand examples, use the sign up button below this video and let me know what you think. I am confident that if you watch and study and learn from this class, you will do significantly better versus limpers. So check it out. Thank you for watching.